In this week number 19, as well as in next week number 20, we will be discussing forms. And forms, they do always require a person to provide some sort of information. So forms we may be familiar with also from a sheet of paper. And here, for example, there are some fields that we are required then to fill out. Or, for example, some checkboxes that we are required to check. And that is exactly, these are the things that we are dealing with on the web as well, such input fields or checkboxes. However, it is a little bit more extensive on the web due to the fact that we can interact with the forms, since we have the mouse or our finger in case we are using a touchscreen device. So things are being dynamic here in comparison to a sheet of paper, which is just static. We cannot interact with it. For example, what we can also create as part of forms on the web are such drop-down menus. Or for example, what we will also be looking at in this week is some sort of a slider, which we then can interact with by using our mouse. So that is exactly what we are dealing with in this week. These form elements. And what's also different here in comparison to a sheet of paper is ultimately the submission process. Now, once we are filling a sheet of paper out, then we are either handing it in ourselves or we are sending it via post. Now, of course, on the web, this is not the case. Of course, here we usually click a button and then the data is being sent over to the server of that according website where we have filled that form out. For example, let's do this example once again, which we have already done. So in here we are dealing with a registration form. It consists of multiple fields. Once we have filled that data, the required data out, we hit the button and then what will happen? We are sending that data over to the server, in this case to the IMDb server. And that includes our name, our email and the password. And then on the server there is a language such as, for example, PHP. We will be writing code in that language later on, so that we then can grab that data and then we can pass it on into a database in which the data can then be stored inside. So now, even though we are going over the submission process not in this week but in the next week, it's important to understand that the data is going to the server. That's crucial to also partly understand some things that we are discussing already in this week. So the submission process is next week, and also most of the elements we will be discussing in next week that can be part of a form. So in this week we will only be discussing 3 elements, and that is because the input field is very extensive. Here we can see the input field. It has, first of all, it has many attributes, and also what type of input, since that one is very generic input. All it means, give me some input. So with this one we can actually create such checkboxes. We can create buttons to upload files, or for example we can create sliders with this one. So it's very extensive, this one, so we will be spending most of the time on this one single element in this week. What we will also be doing at the same time when we are going over these elements, we will then be selecting these elements. There are quite a number of pseudo selectors that are specifically for form elements, including the input field. So those ones we are discussing. And we will also be introducing our first attribute selectors in this week. Due to the fact that these elements have so many attributes, it just makes sense to introduce those attribute selectors in this week, even though they can also be used for other elements. But often they are used for form elements. So therefore we will be taking a look at them. And then once we have styled, of course, once we have selected our form elements by using the attribute or element or our pseudo selectors, then once we have done so, then we can give these elements their appearance, and that is what we will also be doing at the end of this week. Let's get started now with that extensive input element and what type of input we ultimately get from the browser, or what we want him to give us, is all based on the type. And when we do not specify anything else, then by default what is going on, and the default type that is being used here is text. And what that will ultimately give us is just a regular input field in which we can enter some sort of characters. So that is an input type that we would go for whenever there is no meaningful alternative. Now when there is a meaningful alternative, such as for example for our next input type that is of type search, then we should go for this one. So whenever we have a field in which we allow our users to do a search, so such as it is the case right on top here, and then we would go for that meaningful alternative here, because as we know, screen readers used by sight disabled people, they are also reading our code, and so do search engine robots, and the more meaning our content has, the better they can navigate and the better they can make sense of what our website is about. So in this case, that's a meaningful one, and the type text we would really only use when there is no meaningful alternative. And that, for example, is the case when we are dealing with names, such as first name, last name, username, any address related things, such as postal code, street address, etc. Because there are no input types, such as input type username or input type street doesn't exist. So we are falling back then to this regular input type text, which we then will be using, so for anything that has no meaningful alternative. Let's go into the next one. Once again, it's a meaningful one for entering passwords. And there is also a visual difference in terms that whatever data, whatever characters we are entering inside that field, they will not be shown as such. Instead, they will be shown, such as, for example, they will be shown as dots or asterisks, depending on what browser we are using. Next one is an input type that we will fully understand once we are getting started with our PHP language, because that next input type is hidden, and of course it will hide our input field. Now why would we hide an input field? And that is the case whenever we have data that is irrelevant to whenever we have something that is irrelevant to the user who is filling our form out. So it's nothing for him, it's just something for us as web developers if we want to send additional data to the server, so that this data will then help us, it will assist us to do our job more efficiently on the server. So it's just for us such a field which we would sometimes use to send that additional data, and therefore we would hide it due to the fact that it is just of no relevance to our user. These are input types, these three ones, meaningful ones. And now we will be continuing with meaningful input types. In addition to the meaning that they do have, they also have now a certain functionality been given to it, and that is they have touch keyboard assistance being applied to them. Let's, for example, take a look at the first one, and that is type email. So whenever we want our user to enter an email address, then we would use that type, so it has meaning. And now comes that touch keyboard assistance, because not all users that visit our website have a physical keyboard being attached to their device. So such as, for example, some people are using some mobile phones or tablets and they have a touch keyboard. So whenever the input field has focus, whenever they are ready to start typing, then this touch keyboard comes up on their screen. And if our input type is of type email, then what will be available immediately is the add key on their keyboard, on their touch keyboard. So those people do not need to go under specific or special characters in order to find the add symbol, allowing those people to enter the data faster. So it's an assistance given to those people who are using a touch keyboard. And the same applies now to the other 5 that we are now discussing. So first of all, again, they have meaning. So whenever we want a field in which a URL needs to be entered. In addition to this, the www key will immediately be available on the touch keyboard. Now the next one is the type telephone, or in short type tel. And if we are using this one, it has meaning first of all, and secondly, the digits will immediately be available for those people on their touch keyboard, those people who are using a touch keyboard device. Now the next one is the type that relates to either date or time. And here we are actually dealing with 6 different ones that do exist, that do relate to date and times. And the first one is date, the next one is time. Then also if we want our users to enter a date and a time, so usually such things are used when they can do a reservation, for example, as an example. Then also we can allow our users, we have a meaningful type here, if we want our users to enter a date and a time localized, so according to their local time zone, so that one does also exist. And also what exists is week and month, so whenever we want our users to enter either a week or a month to from which they can select among can select a week and a month ultimately, or insert a week and a month. So these are 6 different types here that relate to date and times. However, those ones, they do not have good support at this given stage. It's rather something to keep in the back of our head that those ones do exist, and we most likely or most certainly we can use them somewhere in the future, but at this given stage it's just too early. So here we can see IE 11, Firefox, Safari are not yet supporting it. So it's a little bit too early, just something for us to keep in the back of our head. Now the next one is the type number. Also it has meaning, first of all. Secondly, it is it also gives the digits immediately on the touch keyboard. And it is specifically for entering numbers, as the name already implies. Now in addition to having meaning and this touch keyboard assistance, the type number, as well as the type, the date and the time related types, they also have an additional functionality. And that functionality is that their value that's being entered can be in and decremented. Let's first of all take a look at the type number once again in regards to that functionality. So here we can see that there are buttons being attached to that field. Now this is actually not the case in all the browsers. For example, Microsoft is not attaching these buttons. But however, the other ones are attaching it, and once these buttons are being clicked, then we are either incrementing or decrementing that value. That is what's meant by this in-decrement functionality. Now what all browsers support is once the element has focus, meaning when the cursor is inside here, then we can hit the up or down key on our keyboard in order to in or decrement the value that is inside here. So that is that functionality that is specific to those three types that we are having under this category. Better said, it's actually 8 types, since date and times there are 6 different types that relate to date and time. Let's take a look at the next one, the type range, because this one is exactly the same as number. It also deals with numbers, it has the in and decrement functionality. The only difference is it's not being represented as a field, instead it's being represented as a slider. And as soon as this slider has focus, then once again we can hit either the down key on our keyboard or the up key in order to in or decrement the value that this knob here, this slider here is representing. Let's take a look very briefly, even though it's something to keep in the back of our head only due to the lack of browser support that those ones have. However, let's take a brief look inside the Chrome browser for those ones, for the date and time related ones. At this point it's the time, so here we can see, here we either can increment and decrement, there are also being buttons attached, and also we can increment and decrement by hitting our up and down key on our keyboard. And there is also, in addition to this, there is actually a certain format already provided for us. So in this case it's AM, PM. So there is a certain format. However, as mentioned, it's not very well supported. And also the format is right now cannot be changed to, for example, a German format or whichever country we are coming from. If we want a localized format here to be inside here, it doesn't work at this given point. So really, as mentioned, something just to keep in the back of our head. But let's take a look at also the other ones for a moment. So there is the week, for example. Here we can increment the week, and the year is here as well. In addition to this, there is an entire calendar being attached to this one. So at this given point, when we are seeing a calendar out there attached to an input field, it's all done by writing HTML, CSS and doing the functionality with JavaScript. But that would then ultimately be the native solution in HTML later on, once it has better support and once it also supports maybe other formats here from other countries. But that is what we then don't need to write ourselves anymore later on, or at least not necessarily. We can then make use of that native option that does then exist here. Also, let's take a brief look at the month. Again, there is a calendar being attached, there is a certain format inside here. We have that increment and decrement functionality, either by using the buttons or hitting our keys on the keyboard, the up and down key. And also let's take a look at the last one, so the date. Exactly, again, there is a certain format inside here, so we can increment it by hitting our keys or using those buttons. And again, there is a calendar being attached. So that is something to keep in the back of our head, but that is in particular under this category of this in and decrement functionalities are those date and time related input types. Let's go on into our next category, and here we are dealing with two input types that can either be checked or marked. And the first one is our checkbox, our regular checkbox that we are very likely are used to already, so the checkbox, and the other one is the type radio. So the radio, so-called radio buttons, which is also something that we can check, but it's represented first of all visually as a rounded box. In comparison to the checkbox, this one we can check by clicking it. Once we are clicking the radio button, we can also check it. Now, however, once we are checking it again, we cannot uncheck it anymore. And that is because the radio buttons, they always come in multiple. They never come alone. And only one of those multiple can be checked at the same time. So that is, for example, the case when we are dealing with some sort of survey questions. So for each question, there are 5 radio buttons. So they never come alone. In this case, they come in multiple of 5. And once we are checking an answer here, we cannot uncheck it, but by selecting a different answer, that will immediately deselect the previous answer that we have given, the previous selection. And that is because radio buttons, there is only one solution. We cannot be satisfied, for example, in this case, we cannot be satisfied and dissatisfied at the same time. So that's the reasoning behind where the radio buttons are being used. They always come in multiple when they are serving the same questions, so in this case 5 of them, and only one of them can be checked ultimately. At this given point, our radio buttons, let's just increase them, let's use multiple inside here, multiple radio buttons. At this given point, however, once we are checking the other ones, it will not deselect the previous one. What we need to do here in this case is we need to hand out a name for them. We need to use the name attribute and give them all the same value for this name attribute. And once we have done so, then the browser knows they all belong together and then only one of them can be checked. However, the name attribute has directly to do with the submission. So therefore, we will be discussing that one in more detail in next week. So that is the radio buttons. Now let's compare them to the checkboxes. The checkboxes, first of all, they don't need to come alone. They can, but they don't need to. And they can also come in multiple. So for example, when we are dealing with some sort of registration, we have seen it most likely already, then there may be a checkbox that says, please agree to the terms of our service. And there is a checkbox, we need to check it in order to agree to those terms. So that would be an example where a checkbox comes alone, one only. Let's go to this website here, and here we can see there are quite a number of checkboxes, all belonging to the same question. In this case, which BMW series we want to have listed right here. And now we can check as many as we want to, and checking another one will not deselect the previous selection, but we can also deselect a previous selection manually ourselves. So that is when checkboxes are being used in comparison to radio buttons. Let's go on into our next category, and here we are dealing with two input types that both of them give us a button. And then once we are clicking that button, and a window opens in which we can make a selection. And we can either select among a color or among a file from our local system to upload, to select a file that shall be uploaded ultimately. So here we are dealing with the type color first of all, and the second one is the type file. Both of them give us a button. Once we click it, we can select a color in this case. In the other one, type file, we can select a file from our local system. That one will be attached and will then be uploaded once we are submitting the data ultimately. So these are two types to do a selection, and the color one, however, has not full support yet. It's quite okay though at this given point. Let's take a look. Internet Explorer 11 is not supporting it. Safari, we don't need to worry about this one anymore. The next version will be fine, and most likely the Safari mobile version will be fine soon once they are supporting it, the desktop version. So very likely that we soon only have to worry maybe about the Internet Explorer 11. So something to keep in the back of our head, because we can still make use of it. We can write some remedy solutions here with the JavaScript language if we wanted to. So we can still make use of it, of this meaningful input type here. Let's go into our next category, and here we are dealing with input types that are once again buttons, or at least 3 of them, and they have also additional functionality being applied. One of them can submit the data, the other one can reset the data. So let's take a look first of all at the type button. And this type button is a very neutral input, a very neutral button. Because, or neutral, not neutral, but it doesn't have any functionality on top. It is just a button that has this so-called visual push effect once it's being pressed. But that's basically it. It has no additional functionality given to it on top. In comparison now to our next input type, and here we are dealing with type reset. And as the name implies, it's a button once it's being pressed. Then it will be in charge of resetting the data. And at this given point on our website it will not yet work, since we still need to link it to what it shall reset. But here, for example, let's take a look. We have filled already a couple of checkboxes out. Maybe let's change the slider here as well. Now here is a reset button. Once we press it, everything goes back to the original before we have modified it. It goes back to how it was when the page was loaded. So that is the additional functionality been given to the reset button. Let's go into the next one, and that is the type submit. And as the name already implies, it is not just a button. We also have now additional functionality on top, in terms that once we are clicking it, it will be in charge of submitting the data. At this point we haven't linked it yet to what data it shall submit, so it's not working, but still it has that additional functionality. Now let's go into the last one under this section, and that is the type image. And this one is from functionality, it has the same functionality as the type submit. We can just use an image instead. So when the image is being pressed, the data will be submitted. Of course, what we first need to specify here is what image we want to use. And therefore, since we are dealing with an image here, therefore this input type image is sharing 4 of the attributes that also the image element has. And that is first of all the source by which we are specifying the path to the server of which image we want the browser to use. Then also the width and height we can use here, same as the image element, and the alternative attribute that indicates here some text what the image is about for sight disabled people. So 4 of these attributes that the image element can also be can also be used right here for the type image, since we are dealing with an image. And that will act as a submit button then. Once we are clicking it, it will also be in charge of submitting the data. One additional functionality that this one has in comparison to just the button here is that also its coordinates are being sent over to the server, X coordinate and Y coordinate, where on the image the click occurred at. So that is kind of an image map. It's acting like an image map in case we want to act differently when some part of an image is clicked in comparison to somewhere else. So for this image most likely doesn't make any sense, but when we are dealing, we have seen it with image maps in week number 8. So when one person was clicked, we did a different action than when the other person on that image was clicked. So that is the idea behind it. So if we want that control of acting differently, therefore the X and Y coordinates are being sent over to the server. If we don't want to make use of them, doesn't matter. So, but still we do have that option here. So it gives us that option by sending the X and Y coordinates. Now these buttons here, we have now created by using our input element. But why do we have then the button element, which we have already worked with in this course as well? Now the reason is that the button element was introduced later when the input elements, these input types here, had already been around. Now the button element was introduced later on because first of all the button element has more accurate meaning. Because once we are having an input type submit, we are getting a button or reset. And that once it's being clicked, then it's not really input that's being provided here. So having a button element, first of all, has more accurate meaning. Now secondly, the button element, it does not only give us the same functionality, it also gives us further control on how we want the button to look like. First of all, let's take a look on the same control that we can achieve here, because the button also has this type attribute, and here we can see the list is already coming up, the values that we can use here. Again, it's button, reset, submit, exactly the same values that we have used on top here. So by using the input type button, what we get, that is also the default type, what we are getting is a regular button, nothing else. It has a visual push effect when it's being pressed, but it does not have any additional functionality given to it on top. Now our next one, so reset exists here as well. Reset, let's make them immediately all together here, reset and submit, since it is exactly the same as we just had it with our input element. So these two buttons here, they give us on top additional functionality of resetting or submitting the data to which they are associated to. Now so one reason was that we do have more meaning by using the button element. That's why it was introduced later on into HTML. Now the second reason is that the button element is a closing element in comparison to the input. And therefore the button element gives us further visual control on how we want our button to look like, due to the fact that we can insert other elements in here, such as, for example, we can insert an image. In addition, we could then also insert another span element. So completely up to us here, giving us that further control on how we want our button to look like. And when we are having an image element inside here, we can also give it a source, of course, a height, a width, and we can also turn it into an image map, which we have seen in week number 8. So we can also have exactly an image here being used, and also we can send the X and Y coordinates over to the server, because we can turn it into an image map by using the useMap attribute. By default, of course, this one still has the look of a button, but that is nothing that we cannot change in CSS. We can remove the background, remove the border that's being applied here by default, giving us ultimately the same look as this one. The only maybe slightly difference here is that this one will always have the push effect once it's being pressed. In comparison, this one has not. So if we don't want that push effect, we more likely go for the type image, the input element with the type image, in comparison to making that image by using the button element. However, otherwise the button will give us further control in how we want it to look like visually. It also has more meaning, and now comes a third reason, which we will fully understand in next week. Because this one involves a value, a value for the value attribute. So the value attribute, this one is ultimately in charge, or it directly has to do with the submission process. Now if we take a look at our input type button, this one does not have yet anything written onto it. Also, if we don't want to call it reset, or if we don't want to call it submit, then the control is given to us by using exactly that value attribute. So let me just call it whatever at this given point. Or the reset here, we can change that value, whatever is written onto the button we can change, or submit query, we can change by using that value attribute. Now the value attribute, however, that is also a value that's being sent over to the server. However, the value for these buttons here is taken already. It's reserved for us to define what's written on the button. In comparison, the button element, whatever we write in here, the text will ultimately be on, whatever is in here will be on top of the button. And the value attribute can therefore be used for something else. And that's something else we will be discussing next week. That is the third advantage that the button element has over the input element. So most likely we would go for the button. The input elements, which are more historic in their terms, they are less likely to be used nowadays. So rather to go for the button element. At this given point, our buttons are not yet working, and that once again involves now something that we will be discussing in next week. It directly has to do with the submission process. What we are dealing with in this week are forms. And there is also an element that's name is form. And that form will ultimately be the container box. It acts as a container box for all the form elements that belong to it. For example, here the form element is the container box for all these fields that are inside here. Or for example, the form element is the container box for all this search form here that is in charge of searching. And whatever belongs to the form, whatever is by default, everything that's inside the form belongs to the form. And once everything is inside a form, including the reset and the submit button, then the browser knows, whatever is inside the form belongs to the form, and that is exactly what I need to reset and submit. So that is all we want to know at this given stage. We will go into further detail into next week. Let us just make use of the form element now, so that it is a container box, whatever is inside that element. So let's put everything inside here, including also the buttons for now. And everything that's inside here now belongs to the form, and the browser knows, that stuff belongs to the form, including the reset and the submit button. When the reset button is now being pressed, it will then reset the stuff. And once we are pressing the submit image or the button, the page is already loading, and however, it's not yet sending the stuff to the server, the data, but it's already working now. It's associated. The submit button is already kicking in its functionality. And here we can see these are the coordinates that are being sent to the server here when we are clicking the input type image. So that is our input type, our type attribute and our button now. And once again, very briefly, I want to go back to that value attribute, because with this value attribute, what we can of course do, we can not only define, it's the value ultimately sent to the server. So further we will discuss it in next week. We can define also with that value at this given point, it directly has to do with the submission. We can already insert something into a field. Let me choose the telephone field and let me insert a default telephone number inside here. So that is what we can do by using our value attribute, and that's the value that's being sent. So further details are coming next week. The point here is right now we can already insert something, and the reason why this value cannot be used to check a box by default when the page is loaded already, that reasoning comes next week. Here we cannot go for the value attribute, we need to go for the checked attribute. And this one can only be given for checkboxes and radio buttons. And here we define, when the page is loaded, that we want our checkbox to already be checked when the page is loaded. So here we can see that the other attributes, it all depends on what type the input is, whether we can make use of these other attributes or not. So in this case, the checked is only used for checkboxes and radio buttons. And we will see it will always make sense for which input types the other attributes can be used for. It's logical always, such as checked. Now actually the reasoning comes next week why we are not using the value here. So actually a little exception right here for now. Next week the logic kicks in ultimately. So let's make one of those checkboxes. Let's give it this attribute right here. And this attribute, we either want our checkbox to be checked or we don't, meaning we either specify it or we don't. Therefore, this is a Boolean attribute. We don't need to hand out any value right here. And let's reload the page. And by default, when the page is loaded, this first checkbox has now been checked already. In regards to this attribute, there are a couple of pseudo selectors that we are now directly taking a look at. And the first pseudo selector is, first of all, the checked. So we can select all the elements, all the checkboxes or radio buttons that are being checked. And so pseudo selectors once again are faked selectors. We are selecting the element based upon when they are under a certain state, under a certain condition. We are not selecting the element directly. So it's a pseudo selector. And in this case, we are selecting the checkboxes when they are under the state, of being checked. And that is exactly what we can make use of and what we are doing right now. So when the checkbox is checked, then in this case, I'm just transforming it. I'm increasing its size to 150% of its original. Let's take a look at this one, and exactly that. Once we are unchecking it, it will not receive that greater size. So it's only for those ones that are being checked. once we are checking this one, it's also getting now a larger size ultimately, since checked is referring to either the input types checkbox or radio buttons, so to either or of them. Let's go into the next one, also partly referring to our checkboxes and radio buttons. And that is the case. We can, of course, we have just done it, we have handed out this one attribute checked to our checkbox. So we have checked it by default already when the page is loaded. And that is exactly now another pseudo selector that we can make use of. However, this one is not completely supported yet among all the browsers. Let's take a look at this one. And here we can see that Microsoft is not supporting it. All the other ones are basically supporting it. Yeah, that will be fine, the other ones. Once we are watching this video, let's take a look what Microsoft will ultimately do. But the default will ultimately, we can select our checkboxes and radio buttons when they are checked by default. And in this case, once again, I'm giving it just a greater size. Let me reload the page. And our first checkbox is the one that's being checked by default, even though if we uncheck it now, it will not disappear. Because it's the default one. It was there by default. It will always stay there in that look as we have defined it under this pseudo selector. It is the default one, considered to be the default one. Now if we take a look now at our button, our submit button, this one increased in size as well, 150% larger than its original. So this one was kind of also selected. We have selected all the inputs that are by default, that are in the default state condition. So therefore a submit button is also can also be in a default condition. And that is always the first submit button on our page that belongs to the form. So the first button inside our HTML code that is in charge of submitting. That one will by default be selected. Meaning our second button, the image, or our button elements down here, the submit, will not be selected. Only the first one inside our HTML code, inside that order. So the first one right here. That is also considered to be the default submit button. Let's take a look what a default submit button actually is. Once we are having focus, once we are in this field, for example, now let's hit enter. What will happen? We are hitting enter and we are already activating this button, default button. So that's the idea behind a default button. So once we have entered everything, we just need to hit enter. We don't need to use our mouse in order to then activate to send the data over to the server. So that's the idea behind a default button, and therefore the first button has now also been selected right in here. It also has now received the input, the default action here. If we only want to select the default checkboxes, for example, we can minimize the selection here to only select the default checkboxes, which we are taking a look at in a moment, but that is what the default is doing. Let's go into another one that is directly referring to the radio buttons and the checkboxes. And that is the indeterminate state. So the checkboxes and the radio buttons can be in between checked and unchecked. Now it makes most sense for checkboxes, so that is the case when we are dealing with some sort of checkbox menus. And we may have seen it already, so let's for example check them. And by clicking the top category here, we are checking all the descendants that are inside here. And this one is checked because it's indicating that all the descendants are being checked as well. Once we are deselecting one of its descendants, it now gets this intermediate, this indeterminate state, this in between checked and unchecked, because one of its descendants is not checked anymore. Now, in order to get the effect of this indeterminate state here, however, it involves JavaScript, because we need to check, hey, are all descendants being checked? If not, then apply the indeterminate state to the parent here, to the upper parent. So it involves some JavaScript, but that is the state in which checkboxes and radio buttons can also be in. Radio buttons, it's referring to when none of them are being checked for those ones that belong together. So let's take a look at the second question right here. There are 5 radio buttons, none of them have been checked, meaning those ones are now considered to be in the indeterminate state. So we can also select the radio buttons among which none of them has been checked yet, then they are considered to be in the indeterminate state. In regards to checkboxes, it's as we just saw. So when one of its descendants is not being checked, then it goes into the indeterminate state. So that is what we can do when we are using the checkboxes and the radio buttons. So let's, for example, let me just apply the JavaScript functionality for a moment. I've written here some code already, and now let me give it, for example, a smaller size at this given point actually, so we can see the difference. Let me give it 0.8, for example. And now this one is a little bit smaller. It is now I have turned it into the indeterminate state by using that JavaScript code. So that is something then for later on when we are working with JavaScript. We are going over this in more detail, how we can actually accomplish this. But this is another state that checkboxes and radio buttons can be in. So that is also a selector that is referring to those two input types. Let's go into now away from checked, and let's go into our next attribute. So we have seen with the value attribute, we can already insert a predefined value, and that is not the one that's being used for checkboxes. Here we are using the checked. The reasoning comes in next week. Now what we can also do, we can insert already something inside a field, only for fields. For fields only, these ones make sense. We can insert something that will disappear once the user starts typing. So we have made use of it already on top here. Once we start typing, it will disappear. This is the so-called placeholder. So let's make use of it just very briefly. Since we have seen it already, nothing complicated to understand. Let's just give it to our first input type, the default type text, and for example, username. So placeholder is an indicator to the user of what needs to be inserted right in here. It's kind of a substitution if we don't want to make use of a title. Then we are going for the indicator right in here to give the hint to the user what needs to be entered right in here. Now what we can do here, we can select the username in CSS and give it a different appearance. So what we are doing here is we are not selecting the element itself, we are selecting the placeholder that the element has. So once again, we are dealing with a pseudo selector. However, in this case, we are not selecting the element based upon a state, under a condition under which it is in. Instead, we are selecting the placeholder. It's just a sub-part of the element itself. So that one is considered to be a pseudo element selector. And those ones are done by using 2 colons. And here we can then select the placeholder. Once again, in terms of cross-browser, we can use it completely. However, we need to still prefix it because it is still in testing phase. And that is actually and whenever something is in testing phase, then we need to prefix it using MS for Internet Explorer. Firefox is using MOZ for Mozilla, and then the other ones are using WebKit. Here we can see all of them we can use it completely across the browsers, but why is Firefox highlighted in green in comparison? The other ones are not yet kind of green. And the reason is that Firefox is already using the correct naming convention. In comparison, the other ones are using the wrong one. Let's take a look at this one. So here we need to prefix it first of all. So we are dealing with 3 different prefixes. Now Mozilla is using placeholder after the prefix. The other ones are using input placeholder. Now a placeholder can not only be given to input fields, it can also be given to a text area, the large input field in which we type in contact us, messages for messages. So this is a misleading naming convention. So, but they left it at this stage. So once the prefixes are gone, what it will change to is once it's not in testing phase anymore, it will just change to input placeholder. So that will be the ultimate version of it. It is the first time that we are having a selector in testing phase, that we are looking at a selector that is in testing phase. And there is also something to consider here, that we cannot use one single CSS declaration block by dividing things up by comma, entering the next selector, and so on and so on. This is what we can usually do, but in this case, when there is a prefix in place, it will not have an effect once we are doing multiple selections. So what we need to do, we need to go for 3 different declaration blocks and cannot use just one single one. So that is in regards to the placeholder. Let's take a look at the final result. In this case, I've given it a color in red, and that is what the placeholder has now received. Let's go into the next one, and that once again is we are selecting the element based upon a condition, a state. Not the element itself, so it's once again a pseudo, a faked selector, but it is, since we are selecting it under based upon a condition, it's once again a pseudo class selector done with one semicolon. And we can see it's highlighted in blue already here, placeholder shown. Again, it has cross-browser issues. And this one is actually less fine than the placeholder. Even though it's not in testing phase, however, Microsoft is not supporting it. And Firefox actually is also not supporting it, the current version right now, but it will be in the next. So we don't need to worry about this one anymore. It's just the Microsoft browsers that we do have to worry about. Now this pseudo selector is placeholder shown. So it's selecting the element up on the condition when its placeholder is shown, which is the case right now. Once we start typing, the placeholder will not be shown anymore. So let's, for example, let's test it first of all in Chrome, since the current Firefox version is not supporting it. So the input elements, they have a default width here in Firefox. And I haven't given them a width, I haven't defined a width by myself. So it's all defined in the browser's default style sheet. They just receive a default width. And in the Chrome browser, they are a little bit wider, as we can see here. So only two of them fit next to each other. The other one had to move into the next line. And here we can see that once we are now giving this placeholder 120 pixel only, then it is not yet working. Let me just reload the page. Maybe, right, so I think, yeah, I need to turn the cache. It was being cached. So here we go. So it used the old version of CSS and the cached version in which the change we did was not yet inside. So I just turned off the cache. So here now it has a width of 120, and that is when the placeholder is shown. So under that condition, meaning once we start typing, the input field goes back to its default size as defined by the browser inside the browser default style sheet. Or we can of course always define it ourselves in our style sheet, how wide we want it to be when the placeholder is not shown anymore under its normal condition. So that is what we do have control over, to give, for example, the user more space so he or she can see his characters that are being entered. And then we would maybe increase the width, but only then in order to save maybe some space before that person is inserting something. So that is what we can also make use of, the placeholder shown. Let's go into the next one, and that is autofocus, and this one can really be given to any input type that we are dealing with. We have seen focus already. Focus, when an element has focus, then it means when the browser cursor is concentrated on that element. So in regards to fields, when the cursor is inside and we are ready to start typing. But it's not only in regards to fields. Let me jump from here to the number and now to the slider. Now this one has focus. We can now hit up or down keys in order to increment the slider value. Now I'm having focus on the checkbox right now. I jumped to the checkbox by using the tab key. And now it's the second one has focus right now. The browser cursor is concentrated on it. Now we can hit the space key in order to either check or uncheck it. And that is exactly what we can do here as well by jumping to a button, for example. And then we can hit either the space or the enter key here. Here the default submission will not be activated, for example, in those input types. And then the window opens, and here we can do a file selection or color selection. So really any input type can have focus, and autofocus just means the element we want to have automatically focus once the page is being loaded. So let's, for example, make that happen for our search field. So this one shall have automatically focus, and let's give it exactly that attribute right here. Now we either want that element, that input type in this case, to have focus or not. So once again, we either define it or not. It's a Boolean attribute. We don't need to define any value right here. And now our second field, let me go in here, let me reload the page, and the search field has immediate focus, and we can start typing into here. The according pseudo selector herefore we have already seen. So of course we can select our element that has focus. So whoever's whoever the browser's cursor is concentrated on will now have an outline of, in blue, solid 1 pixel, and that is what's ultimately being applied here. Let's go into our next two attributes, which we are actually, first of all, now comes autocomplete. And this one again can only be given to fields because it has to do, as the name implies, with auto-completion, which only makes sense for fields to have in which we can enter some data. So let me therefore go to the registration page once again inside here. Now, personally, I haven't registered on this website. However, I have registered, of course, on some other websites, and on those other websites I have entered my email address. Now, what we can allow by using the autocomplete attribute, we allow the browser to either store to store our values that we have entered, or to not store the values by turning it off. Now, since on other websites the autocomplete was on and my email address was stored thereby by the browser, therefore it will immediately be available on other websites or on the same website again as well whenever we are entering the email address. We only need to select it from a drop-down menu, and once we have done so, it is auto-completed. That is exactly what autocomplete is referring to. Another example, it has another feature, this autocomplete, in terms, let me go to Facebook for a moment. Now here we can see that there is already an email address and a password being entered. Now that is, we have seen, most likely we have encountered this one already. So once we are logging into a website the first time, then the browser asks us, hey, do you want me to store your email and password so you don't need to enter them next time anymore? I will autocomplete it for you. So that is another feature of autocomplete, and that is always when the browser prompts us when we are logging in the first time, hey, do you want me to store the password? It's stored safely then inside the browser, but the point here is that is autocompletion. And that is something that the user has control over because the browser asks him. The user has also control over that because inside the browser settings, users can always turn autocompletion off and on. So meaning that autocomplete is not the control of that is not really completely given to us. It's not the case. And that is therefore why we have limited use yet of that attribute. It has limited effect when we are making use of it. Due to the fact that auto-completion is a great feature, browsers are nowadays not competing on purchase. They don't need to be purchased anymore. They are competing on user-friendliness, and autocomplete is a very user-friendly feature, and therefore most of the browsers are ignoring when we are turning auto-completion off. So here, for example, we can see Safari ignores the auto-completion when we turn it off. For username, email, password, it will completely ignore it. Or for example, Firefox is ignoring it for, all of them basically are ignoring it for passwords. If the user says, yeah, browser, please store it, then our value of turning it off will not kick in. Also, for example, Firefox doesn't support it for any login forms, anything that's part of a login form, including the email. We cannot turn the auto-completion off. So it's kind of limited, kind of a limited use yet, even though we have control somehow. So something to take a look at maybe in the future, how things evolve. But at this given stage, it's up to the user and the browser. The user basically. When the user wants the browser to store the values, they will be stored, even though we turn it off. Doesn't then work. But let's take a look at this attribute. So it's autocomplete. And this one should actually be a Boolean attribute, doesn't it? Because we either want the browser to autocomplete it, we want to allow him to store the values, or we don't. And that is therefore should be a Boolean attribute for which we do not need to specify a value. However, we can see NetBeans is indicating us, hey, there is something wrong. We actually need to define a value here. Even though the possible values at this given stage are either we want it on autocomplete or we don't want it. We turn it off. However, the W3C intends to introduce other values later on. And therefore, we cannot use it as a Boolean attribute. And here we can see there are many attributes that the W3C intends to introduce later on to even further boost the user friendliness of auto-completion. So that, for example, when we are entering our shipping address or whatever it is, quite larger forms, for example, Then if we are entering our shipping address again on a different website, for example, then the browser, if those when those other values will be introduced, will come alive later on, then the browser knows, that's the username, that's the, for example, the street address, that's the family name, etc. So that that auto-completion can then even do completely entire forms can be auto-completed. But therefore, the browser, of course, needs to know what it is storing. So that's the street address, that's the password, that's the username, that's the nickname, etc. So that is what they are brewing on at the moment, but nothing that can be used at this given stage. But the point here is we can only use on and off, but the point is it's not a Boolean attribute for that reason. We need to define a value. Autocomplete can also be applied on the form element and to turn off or on the entire autocompletion for the entire form. That is only for fields, makes only sense for fields. Now the next ones, they can be given to any input type, and that is read-only and disabled. And we are discussing them basically together because they are very similar, not the same, and we will take a look at the differences. So I have given the telephone number already here. I have entered a default value inside here. That's already there when the page is loaded. Now let me give this input type tell. Let me give it now the attribute read-only. Again, we either want it to be read-only or we don't want it. So this one is again a Boolean attribute for which we do not need to specify a value. And read-only means read-only, so we cannot modify anything that's inside here. We cannot delete or we cannot enter anything else. It's read-only as the name implies. Now this one, however, this field still is part of the focus. So once we are using our tab key to jump around, this one can have focus. And that is the first difference to our next one now, and that is the disabled. Let me now use disabled on our next field here, the date and time ones. The month in this case, disabled, it's a Boolean attribute once again. Either we want it to be disabled or not. So this one, first of all, has a visual difference in terms depending on the browser, so that it is highlighted, it's kind of covered, indicating that this one is disabled. But the visual difference we always have control, that one doesn't matter. So that one is secondary. Now let's take a look once I'm jumping with the tab key and we are skipping this one. So here, that's the first difference that's going on. It's really disabled, it's not of relevance, so it's skipped. It's completely neglected. This one is completely neglected, taken aside. And that is exactly the same that's going on when we are submitting the data to the server later. Then this data here that's entered here is still being sent to the server. And we will see next week that anything that's sent to the server needs a name, because this one will also be sent to the server. So that is the entire logic we are getting next week. So even though if there is an empty field, its name will still be sent to the server. However, if there is a field that's disabled, its name will not be sent to the server. So it's completely neglected. Disabled elements are completely neglected at all. In comparison to read-only, this one, its name will still, and its value also that's inserted here, will still be sent over to the server, and it can still be part of the tab. It can still have focus. Now, when would we use, for example, we would use these things actually only dynamically when we are working with JavaScript. So based up on another information that was provided inside the form. For example, we have a form with two checkboxes. One is male, whether we are male or female. Now, once we are checking that we are male, then we don't need to answer the pregnancy questions anymore, meaning all those fields for entering those for the pregnancy questions will then be disabled. So dynamically, up on a check inside the mailbox, then everything will be disabled in regards to pregnancy, for example. So that's an example when we would make use of it. And if we are a female, then there is only one possible telephone number that we can call. So that's always the same. So we would already enter it and it cannot be modified, for example. So that is disabled and read-only. Now in regards to disabled, there is directly a pseudo selector by which we can select all the disabled elements. And also we can select the opposite ones, meaning those ones that do not have the disabled attribute being given to them. So all the inputs, for example, that do have the disabled attribute will now have a gray shadow. The other ones will have a green shadow that are enabled, meaning all the other ones that are not disabled, that do not have that attribute been given to them. So that is further control that we do have here in regards to with those pseudo selectors. They are directly referring to actually the attribute. It's kind of a state under which they are in, so that's why they are pseudo selectors, but it's kind of really we are selecting based on an attribute here. And that is what we can always do, and that is where we are now introducing our first attribute selectors. So we can always select by attribute. And the common way to do that is, or the way to do it is always using the square brackets. So after the element selections, so we are selecting all the input elements, and now those ones that have a certain attribute, such as, for example, that are disabled, or for example those ones that have the attribute read only, and those ones will now have a background in yellow. So that is what we can always do using the attribute selectors. Let's also make use of the next attribute selectors. We can not only select the elements based on their attributes, also we can select the elements based on their attribute values. So exactly in the same syntax, the way of writing things as we have it right here. So that's the attribute type equals quotation mark and then whatever value we are looking for. So that one with a type month, let's turn it, for example, into orange. And that is now being selected, this one. So here we can then determine whatever look we want to based up on a certain value for an attribute. Let me actually remove that for now so it's not interfering with our next look that we are handing out in a moment. So that is what we can do, the pseudo selectors that are referring to disabled, and we can always based on any attribute we can actually select our elements. Let's go into the next one, and here we are dealing with our size attribute, which once again can only be given to fields. So type any field-like input type that we are dealing with. Because here we are directly referring to the characters that are being entered. And only in fields we can enter some characters. And here it determines ultimately the width of the input field in terms of how many characters must be guaranteed to be visible at a given time. Let's take a look at this one. And let's hand it out, for example, to our first input type again. Let's give it a size of 5. Now the width has now been decreased to a size so that it is always guaranteed that 5 characters are visible without one disappearing again. Now let me enter the 6th character inside here. And now the K, the first character, is now already gone. It's kind of half gone. It has disappeared. So here it guarantees us, and I used guaranteed because sometimes, of course, there are characters that do not take up as much space. So here we can even enter more characters. But it guarantees us that always 5 must be visible without one disappearing. That is exactly what this size attribute allows us to do. So it's kind of a setting that directly has to do basically with the visual size, something that we are actually always doing in CSS. But this one does exist because it would just be more it would just be more effort to do it in CSS, since how many characters are visible, of course, depends first of all on the font size of the characters, how letter spacing, how much space there is in between the characters, and also inside the input field whether there is a padding on the left or on the right. So all those influence ultimately how wide the input will be in order to guarantee 5 characters to be visible. So that is now still we are having 5 characters visible, but it has still increased due to the fact that we have increased the font size, provided a padding, and also increased the letter spacing in between. So that is what the size depends upon. It just guarantees us in terms of characters how many of them will be visible without one disappearing. Let's go into the next one, and that is now multiple, and this is very specific to files and emails. Let's first of all make use of it in regards to our input type file. And that one is right here, input type file. And at this, let's just apply multiple now. Multiple, and of course in lowercase multiple. It's a Boolean attribute. Either we allow multiple files to be selected or we don't. I haven't reloaded the page yet. So multiple is not yet kicking in. And here, if we are holding down the control key and now do a second selection, it will not work. It will always deselect the previous one. So that is exactly, it's only allowing us to do one single selection. Now let me reload the page. Now the multiple is kicking in. Let's browse for it. Let's click and let's hold down the control key and select another one. And this will not deselect the previous one. So we have now multiple files being selected. Those ones will be attached and then will be uploaded once we are sending the stuff to the server. So that is what multiple is doing. It still has a little bit of cross-browser issues, however. Let's take a look at this one. So in terms of the mobile ones right here, Android browser, most likely that one will be gone once we are watching this video. So just something to consider at this given stage. So what we can provide as alternative solution, we provide multiple browse buttons. So another browse button, each file gets its own browse button. And one single file can then be selected for each browse button, then ultimately for each input type file. So this multiple can not only be given to the file type, it can also be given to the email type. Now why is that the case? And personally I've never made use of it, but let's go into the logic why. So if we allow our users to enter multiple email addresses, but isn't that already possible before? Since we just enter 2 email addresses in here and that's it. Now I have just entered something that is not an email address. Let's take a look what happens. Now by default, visually inside the Firefox browser, it's indicated to us, hey, this is not a valid email address. As soon as we hit enter, meaning that will automatically then submit the form, but it will not submit the form because it will then tell us, hey, this is an invalid email address. Please enter a email address inside here. Now once we are then entering an email address, then everything is fine, the page will reload, the submission will ultimately work, and the browser will not consider that input as an invalid email address anymore. However, once we are now using a comma and enter a second email address inside here, then it will still consider it to be invalid. It thinks, hey, this is not a valid email address because it thinks only one email address can be entered in here. And that's exactly why multiple does also exist for the email type. So that the validation, the default validation that is going on here will know, hey, you must validate according to 2 correct email addresses. And once we have done so, then the browser will not consider 2 email addresses as invalid anymore. Now it knows, I need to check for 2 valid email addresses, that's fine. So now we can hit enter, submit the data, everything is fine. So that is why multiple can also be given to that input type. And that is exactly now where we are marching on into the validation process now, into the attributes that have to do with validation. Since that is exactly what's going on here. There is default validation going on here, checking whether it's correct email. And here there is also default validation going on checking whether it's a correct URL. And there is default validation going on also on the number, whether it's a correct number that's being inserted here, which in all of these scenarios is not the case. When we submit the data, that's wrong. Once we enter a valid email address and hit enter, still wrong URL and so on. So we cannot send the data over to the server. However, now what we can, let's do that in a moment actually, but that default validation that is going on here is defined by one single attribute, and that is the pattern attribute. So the browser is using some default values for this pattern attribute in order to do that pattern. As the name implies, it's a pattern. It's checking according to a pattern. And that's exactly defined by the value that the browser uses by default for that pattern attribute. Now, the values we really don't need to be familiar at this given stage, not necessarily at least. And we will not be discussing them because those values are so-called regular expressions. And regular expressions, with those ones we can always determine a certain pattern by which we can do a check against. And such patterns, such regular expressions are created with many different symbols and characters, and also depending on the order and in how they are listed. So it's something that is used in programming, which we are taking a look at later on, either under JavaScript or PHP when we are starting with those languages. So let's just make use maybe of one of them in regards to the password. So let's apply a pattern here. For example, the pattern that we are now checking against is that whatever is inserted inside as a password inside that field must be at least 3 and 8 characters long. So it's kind of an easy pattern that we are checking against. But if we take a look, if we are checking against a certain format, telephone format for example, so it would go absolutely crazy. It looks crazy. It's not that crazy once we are familiar with the characters, what each of them mean and what order we need to apply them in. But at this given stage is definitely nothing that we are going over at this point. So here now we have applied this pattern, and now the browser will check it. So once we are inserting only 2 characters, it's already indicating, in Firefox at least, it's indicating us visually, hey, this is not wrong. And once we are submitting the form, it cannot be submitted. It will tell us, hey, something is wrong here. And once we are in between 3 and 8, it's fine. Once we are going over the top, again, it will be wrong. So that is what this one is doing. And since we don't need to be familiar at this given stage with these regular expressions, there are also other attributes now that kind of also give us a certain pattern to which the browser shall check against, but we don't need to make use of these regular expressions. So for example, min length, max length, that is exactly what we can now apply. So let's give, for example, let me increase the size here to 10. Let's say the username must have a min length of, must have a min length of 3, let's exactly go for those ones, and a max length of 8. So we are restricting the username to have a min length of 3 and max length of 8. So once we are entering now more than 8 characters, we cannot even do so. It's now even stopping at 8. It doesn't even allow us anymore to enter more characters. So maybe an additional feature to the pattern that we have used before, since we can still enter more characters, it's invalid then, but we could still enter more characters. Now in terms of min length, it will also check against this one. However, min length is not yet supported among all the browsers. So Firefox is fine, shortly Safari as well. However, Microsoft is not supporting it. And it's most likely iOS Safari will be fine soon as well, but the Microsoft browsers will be an issue for us in regards to this attribute. Now still, even though it is an issue in regards to Microsoft, or at this point also for Firefox, we would still make use of it if we have a usage, if we have use for it for our form. Because this is the validation that we are discussing right now is really only a pre-validation that's going on. Now here I'm just hitting the keys on my keyboard, but I cannot enter any more than 8 characters. Now the browser, of course, is under the control of the user. So in this case, we are the user right now. Let's just change it away from, for example, let's change the max length to 10, for example. Now we can enter 2 more characters, and that's it. But that is, as we can see, we can always trick the validation that is being applied on these fields. So it's really only something that we would do. So for those people, which are most of the people, that do not want to trick us. So that the data does not need to be sent to the server in order to be validated there. But nevertheless, we would still validate it on the server. The server is under our control. The user has no control over our server. So there we are doing the final check and check whether everything is correct. For example, let me just register here. So it's going to the server. They are not making use of checking whether they are not making use of these HTML checkings that we can apply. So here it immediately went to the server, and then on the server the check happened, and then it came back the data, hey, no name, no email, no password, hey, that's invalid. However, in this case we went to the server, and that is nothing that we necessarily need to do, because that is the reason why those attributes exist. So meaning we are saving time, we are saving traffic on the way to the server, we are saving traffic that occurs on the server itself. So that's the idea behind it. And if a browser does not support it, then at least for the Chrome browser at this point, for the Opera browser, at least those people who are using these browsers, they don't need to go to the server when there is a username when those people have entered a username that is less than 3 characters or more than 8 characters. And then the other ones, then here for the other users that are using a Microsoft browsers, for example, then we are going to the server and then we do the check there and then send back the information, hey, wrong, username can only be between 3 and 8 characters long. But the point here is we would still make use of it. It doesn't matter whether they are supported among all the browsers at this given point or not. So that is what's going on with min length at this point. That's also the case why NetBeans is indicating us, hey, this is an error. Even though it's okay, I haven't updated yet to the latest version. The latest version most likely will understand, hey, this one is supported actually. Let's go into the next one, and that is required, most likely one that we would make most use at most times in regards to validation. Of course, we can tell the browser, or we can tell the browser, hey, if nothing is inserted inside here, then something must be inserted. For example, let's go for the URL here. It's a Boolean attribute. Either we want it to be required or we don't. And once we are reloading the page and when we are not submitting anything correct here, let's submit it. Please fill in this field. It's required and the data cannot be submitted to the server. And required, once again, this one we can select directly in CSS based on that attribute. So there is a pseudo selector when the element is under the condition of being required. So it's basically directly referring to the attribute. But on the other hand, we can also select the ones that are not required. So the optional ones. In this case, the one that is required receives a dashed border in orange. The other ones a dashed border in black. The ones that are optional, that do not have that attribute given to them. So that is what we do have control here in CSS as well in regards to those selectors. Let's go into the final ones here, the accept. That is also validation, but only used for files. So here we can determine which files shall be uploaded can be selected and which ones not. Which file formats. For example, only images can be selected, or only Word documents, only PDF files, etc. So that is exactly what we can determine by using the accept as values. And file formats are always MIME types. Any file format always must be registered at the IANA, and there they are being registered under a certain main category, and then comes the unique identifier that they have received when they are being registered. For example, PNG. So we at this point are only allowing images, PNG images, to be selected. And that means that at this point, now once we browse, before under this folder there were PowerPoints right here, PowerPoint files. Those ones do not even show up anymore since they cannot be selected. So that is what we are restricting here. It cannot even be selected when the window opens. What we can also do is we can select all the images by using the asterisk selector. Same as we do in our element selection, we can select all the elements by using asterisks, same way it's done here. When we want to support all images can be uploaded and also all for example, all PDFs, we can divide things up by comma, and then under the next category, main category application, are the PDFs. So that is what we can allow here, multiple types by dividing things up by comma. And then these are always MIME types. And the MIME types, there is a link in the notes as usual to the MIME types, what we can specify and what format has what MIME type. Now in these regards, again, it's not completely supported among the browsers, but still we are checking on the server anyway which file is being checked. We would make use of it whenever we have a use for it. For example, Safari is not using it. We can only use all images, but not specifically only PNG. It doesn't work. But otherwise it's pretty fine actually. The mobile browsers a little bit less, but otherwise it's kind of okay so far. But we would still make use of it even though it's not supported among all the browsers, since we would check on the server anyway whether the files that are being sent are allowed or not. Let's go into the next ones, the last ones, and these are only referring to the input types that have in and decrement functionality being given to them, and that is min, max and step. If we go into our to our number field, for example, and once we are hitting the decrement button, at this point we can go into negative numbers, which is still fine, which is allowed by default. And that is exactly what we can restrict by using, for example, the minimum. So we want a minimum of 0, so no negative numbers can be allowed. Then the maximum, of course, shall be 100. And that is exactly as soon as we have now -5, it's considered to be invalid. There is validation, then we're checking against our minimum and maximum that's being applied. And that is now considered to be invalid. If we are going for a positive, it will be fine, for example 5. However, once we are now defining a step, which is also another attribute now, of 10, then only the numbers 0, 10, 20, 30 and so on are now being allowed, and therefore the 5 is also considered to be invalid. And once we are incrementing, it also goes in 10 steps, 10, 20, 30, 40, up until 100, our maximum that we have defined. Now exactly the same we can do, of course, for our range, which is the same, just represented as a slider. Let me change the step to 20. So meaning right now we have the step, we have 0. Next one would be this 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. So only those ones can be selected. Each step here is representing one value, one of these values. And that is what we can also do for the future with our date and time ones, since there is lack of support at this given point in general for those ones. So it's just to keep in the back of our head. So, however, what we need to pay attention to here, what's different here in those regards, we need to follow a certain format. So the formats are inside the notes, of course. So let me just go there for a moment. So in regards to date, here are the date, for example, that's the format we need to follow. Then for month, week, time, there are certain formats. And that is what we need to do at this given point. For example, we only allow dates to be selected between October 2016 and December 2016, and in steps, meaning only every 5th day, for example. Let's go into the Chrome browser, since here we can actually take a look at this one, since it is supporting it at this point. So here we can see from October onwards, that's the minimum, and only the 15th, the 20th, the 25th can be selected, etc. Now in terms of incrementing it doesn't work, so it doesn't jump in 5 steps. So this one is actually not yet working. But it's something in general to keep in the back of our head, since that one is rather something for the future. And now let's go finally into our final pseudo selectors, and then we are going over into actually giving our elements their appearance. And the pseudo selector in those regards is out of range and in range. So it's referring directly to those input types that have in and decrement functionality. So that field here and the date and times. And when a number is not in the range of allowed numbers, or it is out of range, then we can give it a certain appearance. So in green or in red, whatever we then determine it to be. And now this out of range and in range is directly referring to some validation. Required and optional is also directly referring to validation, but very specifically. And we can also select our elements completely, irrespective when they are invalid and valid. So it's kind of the main category of selection that we can do here. So that includes required and out of range. So either invalid or valid. And then we can give it a certain look ultimately, whatever we want to. So that's the final selector right here. Let me actually, whatever we have done at this given point, let me out-comment that one, since we are now going into actually giving our elements their actual look. And first of all, what I want to mention here is that the elements that we have discussed, and also the element that is coming in a moment, our last one, those ones are not container boxes, nor are they and they need a width and a height. We need to determine a width and a height for them, meaning they are display inline block by default. So by default they are all next to each other. Now secondly, the input fields, they have a default width given to them by the browser. All of them have a default width already, and that is what we do have control over in CSS. And in regards to the input fields, we really have basically full control. So let's take a look at the input fields first. So I've just given now one input field. I've given it now a couple of settings: a width, a height, a padding, a border, box shadow, etc. So just a couple of settings. And this is so we do have control in regards to the input fields, how we want them to look like. Now this will change, however, now when we are going away from input fields, or when an input field, which is the number or the date, has additional features such as buttons being applied or a drop-down menu, as it is the case with the date. There is complete limited control that we have here. And the reason behind it, I cannot give you any technical reasons, but what's going on here is that the look of the other ones are being drawn from the operating system. So here we can see the operating system, the Windows in my case, also has those ones somewhere. We can find them anywhere, basically. They give us the control to change something. And that includes, for example, those radio buttons, or this slider, for example, or for example, it includes the checkbox. It will also include the drop-down that we are going over in next week. So these are drawn from the operating system. And then the browser, some browsers, they change the look of them a little bit. But the point here is, it's nothing that we can change ourselves by using CSS. So therefore we are limited in order to give them their appearance. So what the people then came up with, let's first of all take a look at this actual effect right now. Let's target the checkbox and the radio button. And let's give them let's change the look of them. For example, let's give them a width and a height. Both of them, the radio and the checkboxes, a different width and height. So what just happened is that it didn't work. It kind of, the entire outer part now increased so that there is 80 pixel width and height. But the actual checkbox or radio button were not being selected. Now let's go, for example, for a background, a padding or a border, and we will see nothing of that stuff will get applied onto those elements. Let me for a moment remove the autofocus on that one so I don't have to scroll down the entire time anymore. So here we can see nothing of those settings, of those property values that we have given for the properties were applied. And that is exactly the reason, because we do not have that control. So what the people then came up with is a property called appearance, in order to then give us that control. How they do it technically, then I have no idea. But the point here is that once we turn it off, the appearance, we tell the browser, hey, appearance none, then somewhat happens inside the browser that will then give us that control. The use of this property, first of all, is limited in terms that it's still in testing phase. The second point is the only value that's so far supported is none. That's only one value that we have access to. And one more comment is that Internet Explorer 11 is not supporting it. So and also that it's completely a little bit not always the case that things work by using the appearance none. So it's still also something to keep in the back of our head. But in terms of the radio buttons and the checkboxes, once we give them appearance none, it actually already works, apart from Internet Explorer. Now Microsoft, also one comment here is that Microsoft, that's the number 2 here, the value 2 here, that they are not using the MS prefix as they usually do. They are also using the WebKit prefix here, meaning we don't need another one here with MS, since this one doesn't work, since Microsoft also uses the WebKit. Now once we have now given that value none, so turn off the appearance so our values kick in again, width, height, etc. Once we now do so, it partly works. Here we can see now large, but the background, for example, here didn't get applied. Background completely not. So it's still vague. It's kind of vague, that one, and it's still in testing phase. So it's in the early stages of that one to be used. Something that more likely that when we are watching this video will be maybe more fine already again. So, but that is what we can do to have at least control of width and height, even though background kind of and border and padding did not really get applied at this stage. So alternatively, for checkboxes and radio buttons, the control that is given to us here, irrespective of now this appearance property, is we can give our checkboxes or radio buttons indirectly their appearance completely how we want it to be. But in order to see that, we first of all need to introduce another HTML element. And that is one that I've been making use of the entire time here. So that is the title always. The title to the input element for which it is for. So that's the title for this input field. So it's a meaningful element, this label, just indicating the title of what needs to be entered inside the field or what needs to be checked, what this checkbox is about. It's a meaningful element for sight disabled people in particular, so they know, hey, this is for that input field, this is what it is all about, what I need to enter in here. And to even further facilitate the work for sight disabled people, there is also one specific attribute that this element has, and that is the element for. And this element for we can use to associate this label with the input field or with the input type that this label is for, exactly what the name already implies. And such an association we will be doing a couple of times in next week as well. And it's always done in exactly the same way. So we are giving the element that we are linking to, we are giving this one an identity. So in this case, let's immediately go to our checkboxes that we are actually discussing right now, because it will give us the indirect solution here for. So the checkbox, which is right here, let me give this one now an identity. So we are linking then to this box, to this element. We're giving it an identity. Let me call it, for example, checkbox, whatever it is, we can call it whatever, or let me call it XY, whatever it is. But the point here is now we have handed out an identity to that element and we can then use it. We can use it for, this is the label, the title for the element that has the identity XY. And in case there is a label that represents multiple input fields, we can also hand out multiple identity values divided here up by comma, and that is also the title, the label for the element YZ, for example. So that is also possible. But the point here is now we have associated the title with the element for which it is the title for, and the sight disabled people now know that. And once they are on the checkbox title and the cursor is on it and they are clicking the enter key or the space key or we are clicking with the mouse here, then this will already check the box or uncheck it. So that is exactly now that control that is given to us indirectly now in order how we can actually indirectly give our checkboxes the complete styling on how we want it to be ourselves. Because what we will be doing now is, instead of now using the label with some text in here as title, instead we will be giving this label a background image. So now there is no label anymore. Instead we will be using our own image, and here we can use our own checkbox instead. Since when that label is being pressed, the checkbox will be checked as well. So let's take a look. We have seen how to create, how to give an element a background image. So here we need a width and a height when we are dealing with a sprite, where that image is being located inside here, and also the position, in this case 0, 0, it's right at the left. And of course here the background image, so this one we are using, exactly this one, and the position. And let's now reload the page. And once I have saved it, and here is exactly that checkbox. Once we are checking it, the checkbox will change already, since that is the title. So exactly that feature is now indirectly control given to us in terms of visually styling our checkbox. Because we know our selector, what we can always do, we have seen the checked selector. So meaning when this checkbox is checked, then what we will be doing, then we want to select our label element and change the background. So up on that pseudo selector. But in CSS, we can only select the next following sibling. So we cannot, when this one is checked, we cannot select the previous sibling. That doesn't work. So what we need to do, we need to take that label and put it afterwards. And now, exactly that is what we can do now here. When the radio button, or when the checkbox is being checked, then the next sibling, which is the label, then the next sibling, then we are changing the background to then ultimately the checked. So that is how we have that indirect control, how we can make our checkbox look however we want to. So that is based on that one, based on that feature. And of course what we would do then here, we would of course hide then. That's the final step here. We would go to the checkbox and give it display none. And that's the final stage. Once we have done so, then only what's left is this one, our label. And that is exactly our checkbox indirectly. And that is what we can do with our radio buttons again as well. Let's very briefly do it here too. So what we always need to do, first of all, the input element, we are linking it to its title. So in this case, we are handing out an identity to the element that we are linking to. And exactly that is what we are using for the label. It's the label for the field with the identity radio button. And then in CSS, we can give it a certain appearance, how we want it to be, to look, the label, how we want the label to look. And when the checkbox is being checked, then we want the next sibling. So therefore, once again, we need to take the label, since it must be the next sibling, the previous sibling we cannot select. So when the input radio is being checked, then its next sibling will change its background position inside the sprite to the checked version of it, to the checked version of the checkbox. And of course, ultimately, the ultimate stage, what we would do, we would turn it into display none, and that's the final display none. So that this one would then, on the title, of course, the text we would remove. So to have this final stage here. So that is what we would do here. Now let's go into the next one where we do not have, where we can do that, where we do have that indirect control, and that is our input type file. Let's take a look at this one. Once we are selecting it in CSS, what will actually happen? So let me first of all give it a width and a height of only a width of 100, for example. Now here we can see that it will not only select the button, but also the text that's next to it, that's indicating always to us what file, the file name that's being selected, or how many files. So by selecting the file, we are selecting not only the button, and that is exactly our problem. So let me out comment maybe width and height again. And let me now give it, for example, a background color in blue. And exactly that's the point. We do not have control over that button. So again, we can do things indirectly in exactly the same way as we have just done it with our checkboxes and radio buttons. So in this case, the input type file, we are giving it an identity. We are linking it to it. So meaning as soon as we click the title, not necessarily the button, already the window will open. And what we will do now, we will just hide the input type and set it to display none. And let's remove the background color blue. It's display none. So only the file that the title click will occur in the window to open. And that is exactly now what we will be styling, the label. And that is what I have already prepared here. So let me just give it some appearance here, certain width, height, etc. And now we have our own file that's being clicked, and then the window opens. The only difference now is the part that's next to it, that's indicating what file is being selected, is now gone. So here we would need to write additional JavaScript code. But that is how we at least can get our button, our file upload button, to have our appearance, how we want it to be. And let's now discuss the other ones. So that is, first of all, our slider, the buttons that are being attached here. Next, it is then also for date and times, the calendar and the format that's inside, the buttons that are being attached there. It's how the type color looks inside here, how this one appears. So all that control is completely not given to us as well. And if we change it to appearance none, then we actually, the browsers give us some selectors that give us that control. WebKit inner spin button, for example, in order to select the number button, the first one here, or the outer one. Or for example, in regards to the slider, they give us control of the thumb or of the slider itself, here by using those selectors here. However, they are completely not on a standard track. They are not standard, and they are not on a standard. They will not become standard. Meaning if we are making use of these selectors, once we have turned the appearance off, that is always what we need to do first. Appearance none. Then once we are making use of these selectors to style those the ones, then it will still break. Our website will break in the future. So it is really not recommended for those to be used. So here we can make it blue and give it whatever, but completely not recommended. We need to wait what the people come up with later on. They are working on it. So let's see what the future will bring us. Currently it's January 2017. So let's see what the future will bring us, but it's really not recommended to use the browser specific ones here. Otherwise our website will break in the future when they will change it, when they decided upon the real way to go. So it's really not recommended for them to use. And same is referring to the validation messages that always come up once we entered a wrong URL. Those messages, we only have control by using these ones here, which are not recommended to be used. So if we really want to have control over them, what we can do at this given point, what people do is they create the stuff themselves. So let's take a look at those fields and everything that we actually have here. Because a field, for example, is just a box. And the functionality that there is a cursor inside, then a cursor is just a box as well, and that this one is blinking when it has focus. That functionality we can write with JavaScript. Same in regards to those buttons. We can put them on top of an input field by out of flow positioning, and then we can give it its functionality when they are being pressed. We can write that code using JavaScript. Also, a slider is just a box. This one is just a box too. So we can always create it ourselves. It can all be done by writing our own stuff and using JavaScript to make the functionality. And that is, for example, what's going on right here as well. So this is nothing that we can create natively in HTML. They just created that themselves using HTML, CSS. And for the functionality, when this is pressed, when this event occurs, then some JavaScript is kicking in then. So that is what we can do at this given point. And in next week we will be discussing now the other elements that are under this category, and we will be selecting them and giving them their appearance. And then in the second part of next week we will be going into the submission process then, in which we will then also be discussing the other attributes that we haven't yet discussed in this week.